The smell of roasted chicken, my favorite thing in the whole world, was supposed to be a sign of happiness. It was the Sunday smell, a warm, savory promise that everything was right in our little world. Mom's special recipe, with bits of rosemary and a hint of lemon, always filled every corner of our house, wrapping it in a cozy hug. But not this Sunday. Today, that beautiful aroma felt like a lie. It was being crushed by a silence so heavy and cold that it was hard to draw a breath. It was a quiet so absolute that I could hear the frantic, tiny beat of my own heart. We were all sitting at the big wooden table, the one Dad had proudly polished just yesterday. The Sunday plates, with the little blue flowers around the rim, were in front of us, piled high with food that was starting to look less and less real. My mom, Sarah, sat perfectly straight, her hands resting in her lap. She was staring at the wall just over my head, her gaze distant and troubled. Her face, usually so full of smiles and warmth, looked like a mask. My older brother, Tom, was next to me. At 12, Tom was a master of mealtime annoyance. He could launch a pea across the table with a flick of his fork and hit his target, usually me, with pinpoint accuracy. But today, he was a statue. He was staring down at his own plate, his shoulders hunched, as if he was trying to make himself smaller. The only part of him that moved was his thumb, nervously rubbing back and forth against the side of his fork. And then there was Dad, David. He sat at the head of the table, a king on a throne of anger. His face was hard, his jaw set in a tight, unforgiving line. His knuckles were white where he gripped the arms of his chair. It was his voice that had shattered our Sunday peace just moments before, and his words were still echoing in the suffocating silence. No one's eating until she apologizes. His eyes, cold and sharp, were pinned on me. She. My name was Lily, but in that moment I was just she. A problem, a disruption. The reason the golden brown chicken skin was getting wrinkly and the creamy mashed potatoes were turning into a cold, lumpy hill. My mind started to race, flipping backward through the day, through the whole week, desperately searching for the thing I had done wrong. What was it? I had woken up and read my book. I remembered because the morning sun was making patterns on my bedroom floor. Then Mom called us for breakfast. Had I complained about the oatmeal? Maybe, but I always did. And it never made Dad this angry. I replayed the morning in my head. I put on my red dress, the one I loved. I helped Mom set the table for this very lunch, carefully placing the napkins and forks. I hadn't argued with Tom. I hadn't left my dolls, Daisy and Rose, scattered on the living room floor. They were tucked safely in their box upstairs. My brain was a whirlwind of nothing, a complete, terrifying blank. It was like failing a test for a subject I never even knew I was studying. A hot, prickly feeling started in my chest and crept up my neck. It was the burn of unfairness. I had been scolded before. I knew the sting of being sent to my room for shouting or for refusing to eat my vegetables. But this was different. This was a public shaming for a crime I couldn't name. The lump of anxiety in my throat grew so large it felt like I had swallowed a stone. My stomach gave a loud, embarrassing growl, protesting the sight of all that wonderful food just inches away. I looked at Mom, pleading with my eyes for a clue, a hint, anything. She met my gaze for a fraction of a second, and her expression was a mixture of fear and helplessness. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. It wasn't a denial. It was a warning. Don't push him, Lily. Not now. But I had to know. I couldn't just sit here and accept this punishment without understanding it. I took a shaky breath, the air tasting metallic and strange. My voice was a tiny thread in the vast, thick silence. Apologize for what? Dad leaned forward slightly. The movement was small, but it felt like an earthquake. His eyes narrowed into slits, and his voice was low, a dangerous rumble. Don't play dumb with me, Lily. You know exactly what you did. But I didn't. I truly, honestly, absolutely didn't. A new, colder fear washed over me, even worse than the anger. It was the fear of being trapped. As I stared into my father's unyielding face, a thought, huge and terrifying for an 8-year-old, took hold of my mind. What if I could never, ever figure it out? Would we just sit here forever, trapped in this silent, hungry afternoon until the sun went down? The words, "You know what you did," echoed in my head, bouncing off the walls of my skull. It wasn't an answer. It was a wall. A big brick wall I was supposed to climb, but I didn't have a ladder, and I couldn't even see the top. My brain felt fuzzy, like it was full of cotton. I tried so hard to think, to find the memory he was talking about. It was like searching for a lost toy in a dark, messy closet. Every corner I checked was empty. There was nothing there. My eyes darted back to my mom. This time, I didn't just look. I pleaded. I tried to pour all of my confusion and fear into my gaze, hoping she could see it and understand. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice cracking. It was a tiny sound, but in the crushing silence, it felt like a scream. For a moment, she looked like she was going to speak. Her lips parted slightly, and she took a small breath. I saw a flash of something in her eyes, a fierce, protective instinct, the same one she had when I scraped my knee or woke up from a nightmare. But then, she glanced at my father. The flash disappeared, extinguished as quickly as it had come. Her shoulders slumped, and she looked back down at her hands, which were now clenched into tight fists in her lap. She had chosen her side, and it wasn't mine. It was the side of silence, the side of safety. Seeing her retreat hurt more than Dad's anger. Dad was a storm, loud and scary, but you could see him coming. Mom was supposed to be my harbor, the safe place I could run to. Seeing her shut the door on me left me feeling utterly adrift, alone in the middle of a raging sea. "Do not look at your mother," Dad's voice boomed, making me jump. "She can't help you. This is between you and me." He was wrong. It wasn't between him and me. It was a spectacle for everyone. He had made my invisible crime a public trial, with my family as the silent jury. I looked over at Tom. He was still staring at his plate, but I could see a faint tremor in his hands. He knew something. I was sure of it. An older brother knows everything, or at least they pretend to. The way he refused to look at me. The way he was trying to shrink into his chair. He wasn't just scared of Dad. He was scared of something else. Maybe he was scared of me. What could I have possibly done that would make my own brother scared of me? The question made my stomach churn. My imagination, which was usually full of fairy tales and talking animals, started to paint horrible pictures. Had I said something terrible? Broken something precious? Did I reveal a secret I wasn't supposed to know? I don't know, I stammered, tears starting to well up in my eyes, hot and blurry. I really don't know what I did. Please, just tell me. "Tears won't solve this, Lily," Dad said, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "This is about taking responsibility. This is about respect." Respect. That was a word he used a lot. You had to respect your elders, respect our home, respect the rules. It was a big, important word, but right now it was just another piece of a puzzle I couldn't solve. How could I show respect if I didn't even know how I had been disrespectful? The silence stretched on. The beautiful roast chicken was probably cold now. The sunlight streaming through the window, which had seemed so cheerful earlier, now felt harsh and interrogating, putting a spotlight on my shame. I felt a tear escape and roll down my hot cheek. I wiped it away angrily. He was right about one thing. Crying wouldn't help. I had to think. I decided to try a different tactic. Guessing. If I could just guess the right thing, this whole nightmare could be over. I took a deep breath. Is it because I didn't want to wear the blue dress this morning?" I asked, my voice small. Mom had laid out a navy blue dress for me, but I had insisted on my favorite red one. It had been a tiny argument, over before it even really began. It seemed too small a thing for this level of punishment, but it was all I had. Dad let out a short, bitter laugh. It was a horrible sound. "The blue dress? You think this is about a dress?" He shook his head in disgust, as if my guess was the stupidest thing he had ever heard. "No, Lily, it is not about the dress. Try again. Think harder." His dismissal made me feel even smaller, even more foolish. The humiliation was a heavy blanket, suffocating me. I wasn't just a bad girl, I was a stupid one too. I looked at the food, the symbol of our perfect family lunch, now ruined. A desperate, reckless thought popped into my head. Maybe the problem wasn't something I did. Maybe the problem was just me. Time seemed to slow down and stretch out, like a piece of taffy being pulled. The sun had moved across the sky, and the patch of light on our dining room floor had shifted, now illuminating the leg of my mother's chair. The clock on the wall ticked, each second a loud, deliberate thump that hammered home how long we had been trapped in this standoff. The chicken, once so plump and inviting, now looked sad and greasy on its platter. The vibrant green of the beans had dulled. Our perfect Sunday lunch had died on the table. My hope had started to die with it. My mind was exhausted from its frantic, fruitless search. The injustice of it all was a hard little knot in my stomach. It wasn't fair. It just wasn't fair. I hadn't done anything, but I was the one being punished. My hunger and confusion a spectacle for my whole family. I felt a surge of something hot and angry, but I pushed it down immediately. Anger wouldn't work with Dad. Anger made things worse. If guessing was wrong and telling the truth, that I didn't know, was also wrong. Then there was only one path left. A desperate last-ditch effort. I would have to give him what he wanted, even if it was a lie. I would apologize. I wouldn't know what I was apologizing for, but I would say the words. Maybe the words themselves were all that mattered. Maybe they were a magic spell that could break this terrible curse. I gathered all my courage, which wasn't much. It felt like a few tiny pebbles in my pocket. I looked at my dad, at his stony face and his crossed arms. My voice trembled, thick with unshed tears. "I'm sorry," I began, the words feeling foreign and clumsy in my mouth. "I'm sorry for what I did. I was wrong. I promise I will never, ever do it again." I paused, taking a shaky breath, searching his face for any sign of a thaw, a crack in the ice. There was none. I pressed on, my desperation making me babble. "I'm really, really sorry, Dad. Can we please eat now? I'm very hungry." The plea hung in the air. For a single, hopeful moment, I thought it might have worked. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me. But his expression wasn't softening. It was getting harder. "Sorry for what, Lily?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "If you are truly sorry, then you will name your mistake. An apology without admission is just an empty word. It's another lie." My heart sank. It hadn't worked. I had played my last card, and it was the wrong one. The knot of unfairness in my stomach tightened. He was asking me to do something impossible. He was demanding a truth I didn't possess, and calling my attempt to obey him a lie. It was a game I could never, ever win. Tears finally began to fall freely, hot and fast. I couldn't hold them back anymore. I wasn't just sad, I was completely and utterly defeated. "I can't," I wailed, the sound torn from my throat. "I can't tell you because I don't know." My outburst seemed to finally get a reaction from him, but it wasn't the one I wanted. He slammed his hand flat on the table. The plates and silverware jumped with a deafening clatter. My mother flinched violently, and Tom gasped. "Enough!" he roared, his face turning a dark, blotchy red. "I will not have you lie and cry your way out of this. This isn't some childish game, Lily. This is about the things you say, the mockery you made of this family to your mother this morning. Did you think she wouldn't tell me?" His words were a whirlwind of anger, but through the storm, a few things snagged in my mind. This morning, to your mother, mockery. It wasn't about a dress. It was something I had said to Mom. The word mockery was big and unfamiliar, but I understood the feeling of it, making fun of something. My mind, now armed with a clue, raced back to the morning, after I had put on my red dress, before I went downstairs to set the table. I hadn't been reading the whole time. For a little while, I had been playing in my room, playing with my dolls, Daisy and Rose. Mom had come in to check on me. She had been smiling then. She asked what I was playing. And I, in my innocent 8-year-old way, had shown her. I had been making the dolls talk to each other. Daisy, my favorite, was having a very serious conversation with Rose. And the words I made them say, they weren't my words. They were words I had heard. Words I had repeated without understanding their weight. Just their sound. Words I had heard floating up from the kitchen late last night, after I was supposed to be asleep. Suddenly, a memory bloomed in my mind, vivid and terrible. And I finally knew. I knew exactly what I had done. The dining room, with its cold food and tense silence, faded away. My mind was suddenly somewhere else entirely. It was last night. I was supposed to be asleep, tucked safely in my bed. But a rumble of low voices from downstairs had pulled me from the edge of a dream. It was Mom and Dad. I had crept out of my room, my bare feet silent on the hallway runner, and sat at the top of the stairs, my head pressed against the wooden spindles. I knew I wasn't supposed to eavesdrop, but their voices were different. They had a sharp, brittle edge that made me feel uneasy. "Can't keep doing this, Sarah." Dad's voice had rumbled, low and heavy. "It's unsustainable. We're bleeding money. That ridiculous investment of your brother's has cost us nearly everything." "It's not ridiculous, David." Mom's voice was tight, defensive. "It's a new business. These things take time. You have to have a little faith." "Faith doesn't pay the mortgage," he shot back, and I heard a sound like a book being slammed on a table. "Faith doesn't put food on the table." His voice broke a little on that last part. "I'm working 12-hour days. I'm tired. I feel like the world is on my shoulders, and you're just standing there, telling me to have faith in a losing bet. It makes me feel like a fool, like a complete and utter failure." There was a long silence. I had hugged my knees to my chest, my heart aching for him even though I didn't understand all the words. Failure, I knew. It was what happened when you got all the answers wrong on a spelling test. I'd never heard an adult call themselves a failure before. "You're not a failure," Mom had said, her voice soft and sad. "But you're not the only one who's tired. You walk around here like a thundercloud, David. You carry all that weight, but you never let me help you. You just expect me to—" "What? To read your mind? To just sit here and smile and pretend everything is fine while you treat me like an employee you're about to fire?" The words had hung in the dark space between them. I hadn't understood them all. Not really. Mortgage, unsustainable, investment. They were adult words, mysterious and heavy, but I understood the feelings behind them. The anger, the sadness, the feeling of being alone. I had absorbed the sound and shape of the words, the emotional music of the argument. Then I had heard footsteps and scurried back to my bed, pulling the covers up to my chin just as the hall light clicked on. Now, back at the lunch table, the memory of this morning slammed into me with the force of a physical blow. Mom coming into my room, her smile, her asking what Daisy and Rose were playing. I had been making them act out the scene I had overheard. In my 8-year-old hands, Daisy, my favorite doll with the yarn hair, had become my father. I had lowered my voice to imitate his deep rumble. "I feel like a failure, Rose," Daisy Dad had said sadly to the other doll. "A complete and utter failure." Then I had picked up Rose, who was wearing a little plastic crown, and made her answer in a high, strained voice that was supposed to be my mother's. "You're not a failure, but you're not the only one who's tired. You treat me like an employee you're about to fire." I had repeated the words exactly as I had heard them. To me, they were just lines in a play, dramatic and interesting. I was proud of myself for remembering them so clearly. I had looked up at my mom, expecting her to be impressed with my performance, with my amazing memory. Her face had been completely white. The smile was gone. She hadn't said anything. She just stared at me, her eyes wide with a look I couldn't decipher. It wasn't anger, it was shock, and maybe fear. She had turned without a word and walked out of the room, closing the door softly behind her. I had felt a prickle of unease then, a sense that I had crossed a line I didn't know was there. But I had pushed the feeling away and put my dolls back in their box. And now I knew. Now I understood. Mom had heard me. She had heard me repeat the secret, painful words her husband had said to her in the dead of night. And she had told him. She had told him that I had thrown his most vulnerable, private confession back at her in a game, that I had turned his pain into a mockery. My crime was no longer a mystery. It was a monstrous, tangled thing I could suddenly see in perfect, horrible detail. I hadn't just said something wrong. I had taken a secret that didn't belong to me, a secret full of adult pain that I couldn't possibly comprehend, and I had used it. I had revealed that I had been listening, spying. And in his eyes, I had used his own words, his own moment of weakness, to make fun of him. The puzzle was solved, but the picture it made was 1,000 times worse than the not knowing. I looked at my father's red, angry face, and for the first time, I think I understood what he was feeling. Humiliation. The same thing I had been feeling all through lunch, but magnified by 1,000. The memory vanished, and I was back in the dining room. The world snapped back into focus, but it was different now, sharper and more painful. The blurry outlines of Mom and Dad were gone. In their place, I saw 2 people, Sarah and David, who had secret hurts I had accidentally poked with a stick. My father's anger wasn't just a storm that had appeared out of nowhere. It was the result of a pain I had caused. He wasn't mad about a broken rule. He was hurt. His feelings were hurt. And I, his 8-year-old daughter, had done it. I looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time that day. I saw past the red-faced monster who had been shouting at me. I saw the man from last night, the one whose voice had cracked when he'd said the word failure. I saw the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes. I had taken his deepest fear, a fear he had only shared with his wife in the dark, and I had turned it into a puppet show. The shame that washed over me was 1,000 times heavier than the confusion I had felt before. My tears were still falling, but they weren't tears of frustration anymore. They were tears of a deep, aching regret. I had been so focused on the unfairness of my punishment that I hadn't seen the fairness of his pain. My throat was tight, but I knew what I had to do. There would be no more guessing, no more empty words. Just the truth. "I'm sorry," I whispered. And this time, the words felt real. They felt heavy. I looked straight at him, forcing myself not to look away from his angry, wounded eyes. "I'm sorry for what I said this morning, with Daisy and Rose." My mother let out a tiny, choked sob. My father's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered, a sign that he was listening. I was at the top of the stairs last night, I confessed, my voice barely audible. I heard you. You and Mom. I heard the words. I didn't know what they meant. Not really. They just sounded important, like from a movie. I didn't know they were a secret. I didn't know they were real. I was just playing. I'm so sorry. The confession hung in the air, complete and fragile. I had laid the whole ugly truth on the table, right next to the cold chicken. I held my breath, bracing for another explosion of anger, but it didn't come. My father stared at me for a long, silent moment. His jaw was still tight, but something in his face began to crumble. The anger, which had been like a solid iron mask, started to crack. It wasn't forgiveness I saw, not yet. It was something else. It was understanding. He wasn't looking at a malicious little girl anymore. He was looking at his daughter, who had stumbled into a dark corner of his adult world and gotten lost. He deflated. The rigid posture, the booming anger, it all just seeped out of him. He slumped back in his chair and covered his face with one hand, letting out a long, ragged breath. It was the sound of a man who had been holding a massive weight for far too long. After a moment that felt like an eternity, he dropped his hand and looked at me. His eyes were red-rimmed and exhausted. "Okay, Lily," he said, his voice raspy and quiet. "Okay." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't, "I forgive you." But it was enough. It was the end of the war. My mother finally moved. She reached across the small space between us and put her hand over mine. It was warm and trembling. I looked at her, and she gave me a weak, watery smile. Across the table, I saw my brother Tom finally lift his head. He looked from me to Dad, his face filled with a profound relief. Then my father did something that shocked me. He picked up his fork. He reached over to the platter and, with a slightly unsteady hand, served himself a piece of the cold roasted chicken. He looked at my mom. "Sarah," he said, his voice still rough, "pass the potatoes, please." We ate our lunch in silence. But it was a new kind of silence. It wasn't the loud, angry silence from before. It was a quiet, careful silence. A healing silence. The food was cold, but I didn't care. Every bite felt like a step away from the terrible afternoon. I didn't understand all the problems of my parents' world that day. I didn't understand mortgages or investments or the crushing weight of adult fears. But I learned that words have power. I learned that behind the faces of the grown-ups you love, there are secret rooms full of sadness and worry. And I learned that an apology, a real one, isn't about saying the magic words to make your punishment go away. It's about trying to understand the hurt you caused in someone else. It was a hard, painful lesson, one served with a cold Sunday lunch, but it was one I would never forget. Sometimes the heaviest battles are the ones we can't see, fought in the quiet moments after children are supposed to be asleep. Remember to listen, not just to the words people say, but to the feelings they hide behind them. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a message of understanding.